Number 1. Phil Spector. He was not merely a rock star. He was the architect of rock and roll itself. To understand the magnitude of his fall, you first have to understand the height of his throne. Phil Spector was the tycoon of teen, the mad genius who invented the wall of sound, a production technique so dense, so layered, and so revolutionary that it changed the way humanity listened to music. He was the man behind the Ronettes, the Righteous Brothers, and the Crystals. He was the man the Beatles called when they needed someone to save their final album, Let It Be. He produced John Lennon's Imagine. He was arguably the most important producer in music history, a man who turned 3-minute pop songs into little symphonies for the kids. But behind the dark sunglasses and the velvet suits, Phil Spector was hiding a soul that was slowly rotting away into paranoia and violence. We are embarking on a dark journey into the lives of 10 musical icons who crossed the ultimate line. These are the stories of the legends who went from sold-out stadiums to maximum security prison cells. If you believe that the truth behind the music deserves to be told, no matter how ugly it gets, please subscribe to our channel right now. And if you value deep dive investigations that honor the history of rock and roll, hit the like button to help us keep these stories alive. The tragedy of Phil Spector is that the signs were there for decades, flashing like neon lights on the Sunset Strip. But the industry chose to ignore them because the hits kept coming. He wasn't just eccentric, he was dangerous. He had a terrifying obsession with firearms and control. Legends abound of his studio sessions turning into hostage situations. He famously fired a gun into the ceiling while recording with John Lennon, causing the Beatle to shout, "Phil, if you're going to kill me, but don't fuck with my ears." He allegedly pulled a gun on Leonard Cohen. He held the punk band The Ramones at gunpoint to force them to play a riff over and over again. For 40 years, his genius was his alibi. He was the Mad King of Hollywood, living in a literal castle, the Pyrenees Castle in Alhambra, California, surrounded by high walls, bodyguards, and his own demons. On the night of February 3, 2003, the Mad King went looking for company. He ended up at the House of Blues in West Hollywood, where he met a beautiful, 40-year-old actress named Lana Clarkson. Lana was a cult figure in her own right, the star of 80s fantasy films like Barbarian Queen. But she was currently working as a VIP hostess, trying to make ends meet in a town that is often cruel to aging beauties. Spector charmed her. He invited her back to his castle for a drink. At first she refused, but eventually she agreed to go for just one. It was a decision that would cost her life. They were driven to the castle in Spector's limousine. They went inside, and roughly an hour later, the chauffeur, Adriana de Souza, who was waiting outside, heard a sound that froze his blood. It wasn't a drum beat. It wasn't a cymbal crash. It was a gunshot. Moments later, Phil Spector emerged from the back door of the castle. He was holding a gun. According to the chauffeur's sworn testimony, Spector looked him in the eye and said 5 chilling words. "I think I killed somebody." When police entered the foyer of the castle, they found Lana Clarkson slumped in a chair. She had been shot through the mouth with a .38 Colt revolver. Her teeth were scattered on the carpet. The genius producer was standing over her, blood on his hands. But almost immediately, the spin began. Spector, realizing the reality of what he had done, changed his story. He told police that she had kissed the gun. He claimed she had committed suicide. He claimed it was an accidental suicide. He tried to paint Lana as a depressed, desperate woman who had ended her own life in a stranger's home. The trial that followed in 2007 was a spectacle of the grotesque. Phil Spector arrived at court every day wearing bizarre, giant afro wigs and flamboyant suits, looking more like a cartoon villain than a defendant. His defense team, funded by his millions, tried to destroy Lana Clarkson's reputation, painting her as unstable. But the prosecution had a parade of witnesses, women who had dated Spector in the past. They all told the same terrifying story. They would go back to his house, try to leave, and he would lock the doors and pull a gun on them. Lana Clarkson wasn't a suicide. She was just the first woman who didn't survive the date. This case brings up a terrifying reality about the tortured genius. For years, people laughed at Spector's guns as rock and roll antics. I want to ask you a serious question. Do you think the music industry enabled Phil Spector? Did we ignore the monsters in the studio because we loved the songs they created? I want to read your thoughts on this moral dilemma in the comments below. The first trial ended in a hung jury, but the second trial in 2009 delivered justice. The jury saw past the wigs, the money, and the wall of sound. They saw a small, angry man who hated women and hated losing control. Phil Spector was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. The man who had shaped the sound of the 20th century was stripped of his wigs and his suits and handed a prison uniform. He spent the rest of his life in the California Healthcare Facility, a prison for the sick and the elderly. He died there in 2021, alone. His legacy forever stained by the blood of an innocent woman. He proved that you can build a wall of sound, but you cannot build a wall high enough to hide from your own sins. If this tragic story of a musical genius turned killer captivated you, please hit the like button, share this with a friend who loves music history, and make sure you are subscribed for part 2, where we will uncover the horrifying story of the drummer who wrote Layla and then committed an unspeakable crime against his own mother.
Number 2. Jim Gordon. If you close your eyes and listen to the greatest songs of the 1970s, you are hearing the heartbeat of Jim Gordon. He was not just a drummer, he was a musical architect, a session genius who laid the foundation for the golden age of rock. You hear him on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. You hear him backing John Lennon on Imagine. You hear him with George Harrison, with Traffic, with Steely Dan. And, most famously, you hear him on the piano coda of Layla, a melody so haunting and beautiful that it has become one of the most recognizable pieces of music in history. He was the definition of the Wrecking Crew elite, handsome, incredibly talented, and wealthy beyond belief. But inside the mind of this rock god, a dissonance was growing that no drumbeat could drown out. This is the story of a man who was destroyed by the very voices he couldn't silence, a tragedy that turned the hands that wrote Layla into the hands of a brutal killer. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rock legends turned into cold-blooded murderers. These are the stories the industry tried to forget. If you believe that mental health in the music industry is a conversation we need to have, please subscribe to our channel right now. And if you appreciate us honoring the complex, tragic history of these artists, hit the like button to support this series. To understand the horror of June 3, 1983, you have to understand the slow, agonizing descent that preceded it. Jim Gordon was the golden boy of the LA scene. But by the late 70s, his behavior had become erratic and terrifying. It started with whispers. He would stop playing in the middle of a song. He would stare blankly at walls. He became paranoid, convinced that people were trying to poison him or steal his soul. He brutally assaulted his then-girlfriend, the singer Rita Coolidge, in a hallway during a tour, a flash of violence that ended their relationship and signaled to the inner circle that something was deeply, dangerously wrong. But in the drug-fueled haze of the rock world, his behavior was dismissed as exhaustion or too much cocaine. The tragedy is that Jim tried to get help. He checked himself into hospitals multiple times. He told doctors about the voices. He told them that there were people in his head, screaming at him, starving him, keeping him awake. But the doctors of the time failed him. They treated him for alcoholism. They treated him for drug addiction. They sent him home with a pat on the back, sending a man with severe, undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia back into the world with no defense against the demons in his mind. The voices eventually coalesced into one singular persecuting force. In Jim's shattered reality, the source of all his pain, the witch who was controlling his mind and ruining his career, was his own mother, Osa Gordon. Osa was, by all accounts, a loving, supportive mother who was terrified for her son. She watched him deteriorate, helpless to stop the slide. Jim moved to a secluded house, trying to isolate himself, but the voice of his mother followed him, taunting him, telling him he was worthless, telling him to die. It was a civil war inside his skull, and the good Jim Gordon was losing ground every single day. He starved himself because the voice told him the food was poisoned. He stopped playing the drums because the voice told him he was a fraud. The tension built for years, a ticking bomb that everyone saw but no one diffused. On the night of June 3, 1983, the voice won. Jim Gordon drove to his mother's home in North Hollywood. He didn't go there as a son visiting a parent. He went there as a soldier on a mission to kill the commander of his torture. When Osa opened the door, the man who had played with Beatles and Beach Boys attacked her with a ferocity that shocked the hardened LAPD detectives who later arrived at the scene. He used a hammer to bludgeon her, and then, to ensure the witch was truly dead, he used a knife. It was a crime of unimaginable brutality, a matricide that stands as one of the darkest moments in music history. When the police found him, he was calm. He didn't try to hide. He told them he had done what he had to do to stop the voices. He wasn't a criminal trying to escape. He was a prisoner of his own mind who thought he had finally found the key to his cell. The trial in 1984 was a heartbreaking spectacle. For the first time, the word schizophrenia was officially attached to his name. The court psychiatrist testified that Jim was legally insane, that he truly believed he was acting in self-defense against a supernatural entity. But due to the complexities of California law and the insanity defense rules of the time, he was not sent to a hospital. He was sent to prison. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 16 to life. The rock dot was erased, replaced by inmate C89262. He spent the next 40 years behind bars, a ghost haunting the prison system. He continued to hear the voices until the day he died. He famously refused to attend his own parole hearings for decades because he believed the parole board was part of the conspiracy against him. He died in a prison medical facility in March 2023, never having tasted freedom again. This case forces us to confront the devastating reality of untreated mental illness. Jim Gordon was a genius who was failed by the medical system, by the music industry, and by a society that didn't understand his disease until it was too late. This raises a difficult question about culpability. Do you believe Jim Gordon was a murderer in the true sense of the word, or was he a victim of his own broken biology? A passenger in a body controlled by a disease? I want to read your thoughts on this tragedy in the comments below. If this harrowing story of the genius who lost his mind left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video to keep the conversation about mental health alive, and make sure you are subscribed for part 3, where we will enter the chaotic, heroin-soaked world of punk rock to uncover the truth about Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen.
Number 3. Sid Vicious. He was the sneering face of a revolution, the spiked hair, leather-clad poster boy for the chaos and anarchy of punk rock. His name was Simon John Ritchie, but the world knew him, feared him, and strangely adored him as Sid Vicious. He was the bassist for the Sex Pistols, a band that didn't just play music, they declared war on the establishment. But Sid wasn't really a musician. He was a performance artist of destruction, a young man whose entire life was a violent, nihilistic art project that could only end one way. If Jim Gordon was the tragedy of mental illness, Sid Vicious was the tragedy of pure, unadulterated self-destruction. This is the story of the ultimate rock and roll Romeo and Juliet. But instead of a balcony in Verona, their stage was a squalid room in the Chelsea Hotel. And instead of poison, their love language was heroin and a hunting knife. We are investigating the 10 most infamous cases where music legends crossed the line into cold-blooded murder. If you are fascinated by the dark, gritty history of the 1970s music scene, subscribe to our channel right now. And if you believe that the truth behind the Sid and Nancy myth deserves to be told, hit the like button to support this deep dive. To understand the death of Nancy Spungen, you have to understand the toxic, radioactive bond she shared with Sid. They were the king and queen of punk, inseparable and insufferable. Nancy was an American groupie, a bright but deeply troubled young woman who had come to London looking for a Sex Pistol to latch onto. She found Sid. Their relationship was a vortex of codependency. She was his manager, his lover, and his supplier. They moved to New York City in 1978 after the Sex Pistols imploded, checking into room 100 of the legendary Chelsea Hotel. The Chelsea was a haven for artists, poets, and junkies, a place where genius and madness lived next door to each other. But room 100 was a special kind of hell. It was a shooting gallery, a dark cave filled with drug dealers, hangers-on, and the constant hazy fog of heroin addiction. Sid and Nancy spent their days in a stupor, their nights in violent arguments that woke the neighbors. They were nauseating Nancy and vicious Sid, a couple locked in a death spiral that everyone saw but no one could stop. On the night of October 11, 1978, the party in room 100 was winding down, or perhaps it was just entering its final, fatal phase. The room was crowded with dealers and drifters. Money was flashing, Sid had just been paid royalties, and drugs were flowing. Sid had taken a massive dose of Tubanol, a powerful sedative that leaves the user in a zombie-like state. At some point in the early hours of the morning, the shouting stopped. Silence fell over room 100. What happened in that silence is one of the most debated mysteries in rock history. But the physical evidence tells a brutal story. Sometime before dawn, Nancy Spungen was stabbed. Not in a fight, not in a struggle, but with a single deep plunge of a knife into her abdomen. The weapon was a Jaguar K11 hunting knife, a 5-inch blade that Sid had purchased on 42nd Street just days earlier. He had bought it for protection. Instead, it became the instrument of his lover's destruction. On the morning of October 12th, the front desk got a call. Someone is hurt. When the police and paramedics arrived, they found a scene of squalor and tragedy. Nancy Spungen was found slumped under the bathroom sink, dead from a single stab wound. She was 20 years old. Sid Vicious was wandering the hallway, weeping, confused, and still half comatose from the drugs. He was immediately arrested. His initial statements to the police were a chaotic mix of confession and confusion. He reportedly said, "I did it, I'm a dirty dog." Then he said he fell on the knife. Then he said they had a fight and he stabbed her, but didn't mean to kill her. He was a man whose brain had been fried by chemicals, trying to recall a nightmare he had lived through in a blackout. He was charged with second-degree murder. The punk rock dream was officially over. The punk rock nightmare had begun. The media went into a frenzy. The Sid and Nancy saga became a global obsession. Sid was released on bail, paid for by his record label Virgin. But he was a broken man. Without Nancy, without his anchor, he spun out of control. He tried to commit suicide by slashing his wrists with a smashed light bulb. He got into fights at clubs, assaulting Patti Smith's brother with a beer bottle. He was a man looking for an exit. He was eventually sent to Rikers Island for detox, a brutal, cold turkey experience that cleaned his body but did nothing to heal his soul. On February 1, 1979, Sid was released from jail. His mother, Ann Beverly, a fellow heroin addict, threw him a welcome home party at her apartment in Greenwich Village. It was supposed to be a celebration of his freedom. Instead, it became his wake. That night, Sid Vicious asked his mother for heroin. He had been clean for weeks in prison. His tolerance was gone. The dose he took was pure, potent, and lethal. Some theories suggest his mother, seeing his pain and knowing he was facing a murder trial and a long prison sentence, deliberately gave him the hot shot to save him from prison. Others say it was just a tragic accident of addiction. Regardless, on the morning of February 2, 1979, Sid Vicious was found dead in his bed. He was 21 years old. He died before he could ever stand trial for Nancy's murder. Because he died, the case was technically closed. The murderer deceased. But the questions remain. This case is the definition of mutually assured destruction. Do you believe Sid stabbed her in a drug-fueled haze race, or is there any truth to the theory that it was a robbery gone wrong by one of the dealers in the room? Was it a murder or a suicide pact that Sid survived? Until he didn't. I want to hear your verdict on this punk rock tragedy in the comments below. The NYPD closed the file. They had the knife, they had the confession, they had the boyfriend. In the eyes of history, Sid Vicious is the man who killed Nancy Spungen. Their story has been romanticized on t-shirts and in movies, turned into a Romeo and Juliet for the disaffected. But looking at the facts, it is just a sad, sordid tale of two young people who drowned in a sea of drugs and fame, pulling each other down until there was no air left to breathe. Sid Vicious remains the ultimate icon of live fast, die young. But his legacy is forever stained by the blood on the bathroom floor of the Chelsea Hotel. If this gritty, heartbreaking look into the dark heart of punk rock kept you glued to the screen, please hit the like button, share this with anyone who wears a Sex Pistols shirt, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 4, where we will travel to the frozen forests of Norway to uncover the most extreme, violent, and satanic murder in music history involving the black metal scene.
Number 4. Varg Vikernes. We leave the drug-fueled hotels of New York and the mansions of Los Angeles to travel to a place where the darkness is not metaphorical, but literal. We are going to the frozen, pine-covered forests of Norway in the early 1990s, the birthplace of true Norwegian black metal. This was not just a music scene. It was a cult, a violent anti-Christian movement fueled by corpse paint, church burnings, and a competition to see who could be the most evil. And at the center of this frozen hellscape stood two men who were once friends, collaborators, and leaders of the movement, but who would ultimately become the Cain and Abel of heavy metal. One was Eystein Aarseth, known to the world as Euronymous, the guitarist of the band Mayhem and the self-proclaimed godfather of the scene. The other was Christian Varg Vikernes, the sole member of the band Burzum, a man who called himself Count Grishnak. Their rivalry would not be settled with a guitar solo or a diss track. It would be settled with a knife in the middle of the night. This is the story of the most infamous murder in music history, a crime so brutal and so senseless that it turned a niche underground subculture into a global breaking news story about Satanism and slaughter. We are investigating the 10 most chilling cases where rock stars became cold-blooded killers. If you have the stomach for the darkest true crime stories in existence, subscribe to our channel right now. And if you want to support this deep dive into the abyss of black metal, hit the like button to help the algorithm find other truth seekers. To understand the murder, you have to understand the black metal inner circle. Euronymous owned a record shop in Oslo called Helvete, Hell, which served as the headquarters for the movement. He was the ideologue, the man who preached that black metal had to be about evil, death, and Satanism. He famously took photos of his previous vocalists dead after the man had committed suicide, using the gruesome image as an album cover. Varg Vikernes was the rising star, the young, charismatic, and deeply dangerous musician who wanted to dethrone the king. Varg took the ideology literally. He didn't just talk about destroying Christianity, he allegedly struck the match. In 1992 and 1993, historic wooden churches across Norway began to burn to the ground, ancient structures reduced to ash. Varg was the prime suspect, and his notoriety grew. He became the face of the terrorist wing of black metal. But as Varg's fame eclipsed Euronymous', a toxic jealousy began to fester between the two men. It was a power struggle for the soul of the movement. Euronymous owed Varg money, royalties for the Burzum albums released on his label, but the conflict went far deeper than cash. It was about credibility. It was about who was the true Lord of Chaos. By August 1993, the tension had reached a boiling point. Paranoia was rampant. Varg claimed that he had heard through the grapevine that Euronymous was plotting to kidnap him. According to Varg's version of events, a version he maintains to this day, Euronymous planned to knock him out with a stun gun, tie him up, drive him to the woods, and torture him to death while filming it for a snuff movie. Whether this plot was real or a product of Varg's own paranoid delusions is debated, but Varg decided to launch a preemptive strike. On the night of August 10, 1993, Varg Vikernes, accompanied by another musician named Snorre Ruch, drove 300 miles from Bergen to Oslo. He claimed he was going to hand over a contract to end their business relationship, but he brought something else with him, a blunt knife and a seething, murderous intent. They arrived at Euronymous' apartment building in the dead of night. Varg buzzed the intercom. Euronymous, awaking, let him in. What happened next in that stairwell is the stuff of nightmares. Varg entered the apartment on the 4th floor. An argument ensued almost immediately. According to Varg, Euronymous panicked and kicked him in the chest. Varg pulled his knife. The godfather of black metal, the man who preached death and destruction, realized he was facing the real thing. He ran. He ran into the kitchen to grab a knife, but Varg was faster. Varg stabbed him. Euronymous stumbled out of the apartment screaming for help, banging on neighbors' doors, ringing bells, his blood smearing the walls of the stairwell. Varg chased him. This wasn't a fight, it was a hunt. Varg stabbed him repeatedly as he fled down the stairs. Finally, he cornered him. Varg plunged the knife into Euronymous' skull, killing him instantly. The autopsy later revealed the sheer savagery of the attack. Euronymous had been stabbed 23 times, 2 to the head, 5 to the neck, and 16 to the back. It was an overkill that spoke of a deep, personal hatred. Varg fled the scene, driving back to Bergen, disposing of his bloody clothes and trying to create an alibi. But he had been sloppy. He had left a contract with his fingerprints on it in the apartment. He was arrested days later. The trial in 1994 was a media circus unlike anything Norway had ever seen. Varg didn't hide his face. He didn't show remorse. In fact, he famously turned to the cameras in the courtroom and smiled, a chilling, arrogant smirk that became the defining image of the entire genre. He claimed self-defense, arguing that he only stabbed Euronymous because Euronymous was attacking him, and that most of the cuts were from broken glass that the victim had fallen on. The court didn't buy it for a second. The sheer number of stab wounds to the back indicated a man fleeing for his life, not an aggressor. The prosecution painted Varg as a cold-blooded killer who murdered his rival to cement his status as the supreme leader of the black metal underground. This case is unique because the killer is not only alive, but is still a public figure who writes books and blogs. Do you believe his story of self-defense, or was this a calculated execution for fame and power? Was Varg a victim of a plot, or the architect of his own dark legend? I want to hear your verdict on this Norwegian nightmare in the comments below. Varg Vikernes was found guilty of first-degree murder and arson for the burning of 3 churches. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, which is the maximum sentence allowed under Norwegian law. He served 15 years and was released on parole in 2009. He walked out of prison not as a reformed man, but as an icon to the far right and the extreme metal underground, unrepentant and defiant. The murder of Euronymous marked the end of the second wave of black metal, changing music history forever. It proved that the darkness these musicians sang about wasn't just lyrics. For some, it was a lifestyle. And for Euronymous, it was a death sentence. If this chilling journey into the frozen heart of darkness kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button, share this video with your metalhead friends, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 5, where we will travel back to the 1960s to uncover the most brutal, torture-filled murder ever committed by a country western star.
Number 5. Spade Cooley. We leave the frozen forests of Norway and travel back in time to the golden, sun-drenched plains of California in the 1940s and 50s, to an era of cowboys, fiddles, and wholesome family entertainment. But do not let the cowboy hats and the smiles fool you. The story we are about to uncover is widely considered the most gruesome, sadistic, and prolonged act of torture and murder ever committed by a famous musician. This is the story of Donald Clyde Cooley, known to the world as Spade Cooley, the self-proclaimed king of Western swing. He was a superstar who rivaled Roy Rogers, a man with his own television show, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation as a Hollywood power player. He was the smiling face of Saturday night television, the man who brought joy to millions with his fiddle. But behind the stage lights and the sequined suits, Spade Cooley was a monster fueled by alcohol, pills, and a pathological jealousy that would eventually turn his ranch home into a slaughterhouse. This case is a terrifying reminder that the brightest smiles often hide the darkest impulses, and that domestic violence does not care about fame or fortune. We are investigating the 10 most chilling cases where music icons became cold-blooded killers. If you have the stomach for the true, unvarnished history of crime in the entertainment industry, subscribe to our channel right now. And if you believe that the victims of these horrific crimes deserve to be remembered, hit the like button to support this investigation. The victim of this nightmare was Ella Mae Cooley, Spade's wife and a former singer in his band. She was beautiful, talented, and trapped in a marriage that had become a prison. By 1961, Spade's career was in decline. The era of Western swing was fading, replaced by rock and roll, and Spade was not handling the transition well. He was drinking heavily, suffering from heart trouble, and becoming increasingly paranoid that Ella Mae was having affairs. He had forced her to confess to infidelities that may have only existed in his drunken imagination. She wanted a divorce, she wanted to escape. But in Spade's mind, she was his property, and no one walks away from the king. On the tragic evening of April 3, 1961, the couple was at their sprawling ranch in Willow Springs, California. What happened that night is not just a murder, it is a torture session that defies comprehension. Spade Cooley didn't just snap. He engaged in a systematic destruction of his wife. In a rage fueled by alcohol and his own demons, he began to beat Ella Mae. But this wasn't a quick assault. It lasted for hours. He slammed her head against the floor repeatedly. He stomped on her stomach with his boots. But the detail that makes this case uniquely horrific, the detail that still sickens detectives and historians decades later, is how he used his cigarette. He lit a cigarette, smoked it, and then burned his wife's body with the lit end to torture her into confessing her affairs. He did this over and over again, and he didn't do it in secret. The most heartbreaking aspect of this crime is that the couple's 14-year-old daughter, Melody, was in the house. Spade forced his terrified daughter to watch parts of the beating, telling her, "You're going to watch me kill her." It was a level of psychological sadism that is rare even in the annals of true crime. Melody was paralyzed by fear, trapped in a house with a father who had transformed into a demon. After hours of agony, Ella Mae finally succumbed to her injuries. She had been beaten so badly, her crushing chest injuries had stopped her heart. When Spade realized she was dead, the celebrity persona kicked back in. He didn't run. He called an ambulance. He tried to spin a story.
He told the paramedics and the police that she had fallen in the shower. It was a ludicrous lie. When the authorities arrived, the evidence of torture was written all over her body. There were cigarette burns, massive bruising, and signs of a prolonged struggle. The king of Western swing was arrested on the spot, his hands stained with the blood of the woman he had promised to love and cherish. The news shocked America. It was the equivalent of finding out that someone like Garth Brooks or Tim McGraw had tortured their spouse to death. It shattered the wholesome image of country music. The trial in 1961 was a sensation. Spade's lawyers tried to argue that he had suffered a heart attack during the argument and was not in control of his faculties, a desperate and flimsy defense. But the prosecution had a witness that Spade could not intimidate, his daughter, Melody. In a courtroom filled with cameras and fans, the teenage girl took the stand and bravely testified against her father. She described the stomping, the screaming, and the threats. Her testimony was the final nail in the coffin of the king's career. The jury deliberated and found Spade Cooley guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, disgusted by the torture elements of the crime, sentenced him to life in prison. The man who had once commanded the biggest stages in California was now inmate A42827 at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. But the story has one final bizarre twist that feels like it was written by a screenwriter. Spade Cooley was a model prisoner. He taught music to fellow inmates, he was charming, and he used his connections. After serving 8 years, the state of California decided to grant him parole. He was scheduled to be released on November 25, 1969. 3 days before his release, the Sheriff's Association of Alameda County invited him to perform a benefit concert in Oakland. It was to be his triumphant return to the stage, a final goodbye to prison life. Spade played to a sold-out crowd. The audience cheered. He walked off stage, into the dressing room, sat down, and dropped dead from a massive heart attack. He died just 72 hours before he would have been a free man. Some call it a medical coincidence, others call it karmic justice. Do you believe that the universe intervened to stop a killer from walking free, or was it just the stress of the moment? Was justice served by his death, or did he escape his punishment? I want to hear your thoughts on this strange twist of fate in the comments below. Spade Cooley is barely remembered today for his music. He is remembered for the horror of that night in 1961. His story is a grim testament to the fact that domestic violence is the great equalizer of evil, capable of turning a beloved entertainer into a figure of nightmares. He flew high, but his descent was one of the bloodiest in Hollywood history. If this harrowing tale of the dark side of the golden age of country music left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video to ensure the victim, Ella May, is remembered, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 6, where we will cross the Atlantic to London to investigate a legendary producer who killed his landlady and then turned the gun on himself.
Number 6. Joe Meek. If Phil Spector was the mad king of American production, then Joe Meek was his British counterpart, a mad scientist of sound whose genius was matched only by a descent into insanity that was as rapid as it was violent. Joe Meek is a name that every music historian knows, a pioneer who revolutionized the recording industry from a cramped, chaotic apartment above a leather goods shop in London. He was the creator of the Telstar, the first song by a British group to ever hit #1 on the US charts, predating the Beatles' invasion. He was a visionary who built his own electronic instruments, used bathrooms as echo chambers, and turned household junk into sonic gold. But inside the mind of this independent genius, the wires were crossed. He was living in a world of extreme paranoia, occult obsession, and a terrifying belief that dark forces were conspiring to destroy him. This is the story of a man who heard music from the stars, but was ultimately consumed by the demons in his own living room. It is a grim reminder that the line between genius and madness is often razor thin, And when that line snaps, the collateral damage can be devastating. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where music legends turned into cold-blooded killers. If you are fascinated by the tragic, untold history of the music industry's darkest days, please subscribe to our channel right now to join our community of investigators. And if you appreciate us shining a light on these forgotten tragedies, hit the like button to support the channel. To understand the horror of February 3, 1967, you have to step inside 304 Holloway Road, London. This was Joe Meek's studio and his home. It was a labyrinth of wires, tape machines, and manic energy. By the mid-60s, Joe's golden touch was fading. The hits were drying up. The Beatles had changed the sound of pop, and Joe was being left behind. But his problems went far deeper than the charts. Joe was a gay man living in a time when homosexuality was still illegal in the UK, living under the constant threat of blackmail and imprisonment. This pressure cooker environment fueled a latent schizophrenia that began to manifest in terrifying ways. He became convinced that rival record companies had planted microphones in his wallpaper. He believed that aliens were communicating with him through his recording equipment. But his darkest obsession was with the occult. He would visit graveyards at night to record the voices of the dead. He held seances in his studio, and he became fixated on the dead rock star Buddy Holly. Joe claimed that Buddy Holly's ghost visited him in dreams, warning him of his own impending death. This obsession with the day the music died, February 3rd, would become a self-fulfilling prophecy of the most violent kind. As 1967 began, Joe Meek was spiraling. He was broke, addicted to pills, and increasingly aggressive. He had purchased a single-barreled shotgun, ostensibly for protection against the imaginary spies he believed were watching him, but those close to him feared it would be used for something far more sinister. He had threatened musicians with it before, waving it around the studio during arguments, but it was always dismissed as Joe being Joe. On the morning of February 3, 1967, the exact 8-year anniversary of Buddy Holly's death, the madness finally overtook him. The victim of this tragedy was not a rival producer or a spy. It was Violet Shenton, his landlady. Violet was a kind, ordinary woman who worked in the leather shop downstairs. She wasn't part of the music industry. She was just a woman trying to collect the rent and perhaps ask Joe to keep the noise down. She was an innocent bystander in the war Joe was fighting in his head. Around 9 a.m., a staff member in the studio, Patrick Pink, heard a heated argument. Joe was screaming. Violet was calm but insistent. Then the shouting stopped. Patrick went to the stairs to see what was happening. He saw Joe Meek standing on the landing, looking wild-eyed and disheveled, and he saw Violet Shenton. What happened next was a scene of senseless brutality. Joe Meek raised the shotgun. He didn't hesitate. He fired a single blast into Violet Shenton's chest. The force of the shot killed her instantly. The woman who had tolerated the noise, the chaos, and the eccentricities of her famous tenant lay dead in the hallway. Patrick Pink, terrified, stood frozen. Joe reloaded the gun. He looked at Patrick, then turned the weapon on himself. He placed the barrel against his chest and pulled the trigger for the second time. The Telstar man was dead. It was a murder-suicide that rocked London. The genius who had reached for the stars had ended his life in a pool of blood on a dirty staircase in North London. The police investigation was brief. The killer was dead at the scene. But the legacy of the crime cast a long shadow. Joe Meek's unreleased tapes, thousands of hours of recordings known as the T-chest tapes, were locked away for decades. A treasure trove of music guarded by the memory of a murder. The tragedy of Violet Shenton is often overshadowed by the legend of Joe Meek. But she was the true victim, a woman simply doing her job who walked into the path of a man whose mind had completely collapsed. This case forces us to look at the destructive nature of untreated psychosis in the creative arts. Do you believe that Joe's genius and his madness were linked?
That he couldn't have had the music without the demons? Or was his mental illness a separate tragedy that the industry ignored until it became lethal? I want to hear your thoughts on the tortured artist myth in the comments below. The murder at 304 Holloway Road remains one of the grimmest tales in British music history. It marked the end of an era of innocence in pop production and served as a violent reminder that the creative fire that fuels the hits can also burn down the house. Joe Meek wanted to be remembered for his sound, but he is forever remembered for the silence he caused on that cold February morning. If this chilling story of a mad scientist of sound who turned into a killer left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to ensure Violet Shenton is remembered, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 7, where we will cross the channel to France to uncover the shocking story of the French Bruce Springsteen, who beat a famous actress to death in a hotel room.
Number 7. Bertrand Cantat. We now cross the channel to France to examine a case that tore a nation apart and exposed the terrifying hypocrisy of a man who was considered the moral compass of his generation. In the early 2000s, there was no band bigger in France than Noir Désir, and there was no star brighter than its lead singer, Bertrand Cantat. He was the French Bruce Springsteen, a charismatic, intellectual, and deeply political figure who used his platform to preach against globalization, fascism, and violence. He was the voice of the left, a hero to millions who believed in his message of peace and love. But behind the poetic lyrics and the public activism lurked a volatile, possessive rage that would eventually explode in a hotel room thousands of miles away from home, silencing one of France's most beloved actresses. This is the story of a crime so brutal it shattered the myth of the sensitive artist forever. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where music icons became killers. If you believe that justice should be blind to fame and that the victims of these tragedies deserve to be heard, please subscribe to our channel right now to join our community. And if you appreciate us shedding light on this international tragedy, hit the like button to support this investigation. The victim of this nightmare was Marie Trintignant. She was French royalty, the daughter of legendary actor Jean-Louis Trintignant and a celebrated actress in her own right. She was beautiful, talented, and fiercely independent, a mother of 4 who was in Lithuania filming a movie about the writer Colette. Bertrand Cantat had accompanied her to Vilnius, but their relationship, which had begun as a passionate whirlwind, had quickly descended into a cycle of jealousy and control. Cantat was obsessively possessive, reportedly isolating Marie from her friends and family, unable to handle her independence or her past relationships. On the night of July 26, 2003, in their suite at the Domina Plaza Hotel, that jealousy turned lethal. The argument reportedly started over a text message Marie had received from her ex-husband, a simple, friendly message that sent Cantat into a blind, alcoholic fury. But this was not a lover's quarrel. It was a massacre. What happened next was not a push or a shove. It was a sustained, savage beating. According to the autopsy and court testimony, Cantat struck Marie Trintignant 19 times in the head. He punched her with such force that he broke the bones of his own hands. He knocked her unconscious, dragging her through the room. But the violence of the assault is not even the most chilling part of this story. It is what happened after. Marie was lying on the floor, comatose, her brain swelling from the trauma. A normal human being realizing what they had done would call an ambulance immediately. Bertrand Cantat did not. Instead, he spent hours wandering the hotel room. He called Marie's ex-husband on the phone, rambling about how she was sleeping and telling him not to worry. He ignored the pleas of Marie's brother, who was in the hotel, to get help. For hours, while Marie's life slowly slipped away, Cantat did nothing to save her. It wasn't until the next morning, nearly 7 hours after the beating, that help was finally summoned. By then, it was too late. Marie Trintignant never woke up. She died in a hospital in Paris days later, the victim of a cerebral edema caused by the man who claimed to love her. The trial in Lithuania was a spectacle that gripped all of Europe.
Cantat claimed it was an accident, a madness that overtook him, trying to paint himself as a tragic figure. But the evidence of the 19 blows told a different story. It spoke of a rage that wanted to destroy. The French public was divided, with some diehard fans trying to defend him, but the majority were horrified by the brutality and the callous delay in seeking help. In 2004, the Lithuanian court sentenced Bertrand Cantat to 8 years in prison for murder with indirect intent. To many, especially Marie's family, this sentence was an insult. 8 years for beating a woman to death, it seemed like a celebrity discount. But the story gets even more infuriating for those seeking justice. Cantat did not serve 8 years. He was transferred to a French prison, and due to good behavior statutes, he was released on parole in 2007 after serving only 4 years. He walked free. He tried to restart his music career. He played festivals. He was put on the cover of magazines. It sparked outrage and protests from women's rights groups who couldn't believe that a man who beat a woman to death was being welcomed back as a rock star. This case forces us to confront the disturbing reality of how society treats famous men who commit violence against women. Does the art excuse the artist? Should Bertrand Cantat have been allowed to return to the stage, or should his career have ended the moment he raised his fist? Do you think 4 years was justice for Marie Cantintian? I want to read your verdict on this failure of justice in the comments below. The tragedy didn't even end there. In 2010, Cantat's ex-wife, Christina Roddy, who had defended him during the trial, committed suicide. In a chilling final voice message found after her death, she claimed she had lived in terror of Cantat and had suffered physical abuse herself. It suggested that Marie Cantintian was not an anomaly, but the victim of a pattern. Bertrand Cantat remains a free man, but he is a pariah to many, a symbol of the violence that can hide behind a microphone and a guitar. If this infuriating story of privilege and violence left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video to ensure Marie Cantintian is remembered over her killer, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 8, where we will enter the terrifying world of Norwegian black metal once again to uncover a murder committed in a park by a drummer who wanted to know what it felt like to kill.
Number 8. Faust. We return to the cold, dark heart of the Norwegian black metal scene, a subculture so soaked in violence and extremism that it produced not one, but multiple killers who became icons of the genre. While Varg Vikernes' murder of Euronymous was a clash of titans within the inner circle, the crime committed by Bordy Athen, known as Faust, was a chilling act of random predatory violence that exposed the terrifying nihilism at the core of the movement. Faust was the drummer for the legendary band Emperor, the young man deeply embedded in the satanic ideology that preached strength, cruelty, and rejection of all moral boundaries. But unlike Varg, who killed a rival, Faust killed a stranger, a man he had never met, simply because he wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. This is the story of a murder committed not for passion, not for money, but for the sheer, cold thrill of the act itself. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rock stars became cold-blooded killers. If you have the stomach for the darkest true crime stories in existence, subscribe to our channel right now. And if you want to support this deep dive into the abyss of black metal, hit the like button to help the algorithm find other truth seekers. The setting for this nightmare was the Olympic Park in Lillehammer, Norway, a town known for its beauty and winter sports. But on the night of August 21st, 1992, the park became a hunting ground. Faust was visiting the town, wandering the streets alone. He was 18 years old, a brooding figure steeped in the rhetoric of hatred and violence that defined his social circle. As he walked past the park, he was approached by a man named Magne Andreasen. Magne was a gay man, and according to Faust's later testimony, he approached the drummer and propositioned him, suggesting they go for a walk in the woods. A normal person might have declined, perhaps angrily, and walked away. But Faust saw an opportunity. He saw a chance to cross a line he had been flirting with for years. He agreed to walk into the woods with Magne, not for sex, but for slaughter. As they walked deeper into the shadows of the trees, Faust's mind was calm. He knew exactly what he was going to do. When they reached a secluded spot, Magne made a move to touch him. Faust reacted with a ferocity that was shocking in its intensity. He pulled out a knife he carried in his boot and stabbed him in the gut. Magne, terrified and wounded, tried to run, screaming for help, but there was no one to hear him. Faust chased him down. He didn't just stab him once or twice. He stabbed him 37 times. He stabbed him until he stopped moving, kicking him in the head to ensure he was dead. It was a frenzy of violence, a release of pent-up aggression, and a perverse desire to dominate another human being completely. After the murder, Faust walked home. He burned his bloody clothes. He didn't flee the country. He didn't panic. He went back to his life, playing drums, burning churches, and living as a free man for over a year, while the police hunted for a killer with no motive and no connection to the victim. The murder remained unsolved for months, a mystery that baffled investigators. But within the black metal inner circle, it was an open secret. Faust bragged about it. He told Varg Vikernes. He told Euronymous. In this twisted community, committing a murder didn't make you a pariah. It made you a legend. It gave you street cred. It proved you were truly evil. It wasn't until the investigation into Varg Vikernes for the murder of Euronymous that the police finally cracked the code of silence. During interrogations, other members of the scene, perhaps looking for leniency or simply breaking under pressure, gave up Faust. He was arrested in 1993. He confessed almost immediately, displaying a chilling lack of remorse. He described the murder with the detachment of someone describing a trip to the grocery store. He said, "I had no special feelings, really. It was just, okay, now I'm doing this." The trial in 1994 was another window into the soulless void of the black metal ideology. Faust was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 9 years and 4 months before being released in 2003. In a move that disgusted many, he immediately returned to the music scene. He rejoined Emperor for a time, played festivals, and continued his career as a respected musician in the metal world. While some fans boycotted him, many others separated the art from the artist, welcoming back a man who had stabbed a stranger 37 times in a park. This brings us to a disturbing question about rehabilitation and forgiveness. Can a man who kills for a thrill ever truly be reformed? Should the metal community have embraced him again? Or should he have been shunned for life? I want to hear your thoughts on the ethics of supporting artists with blood on their hands in the comments below. Faust's crime remains a stark reminder of the dangers of extremist ideologies, even when they are wrapped in the aesthetic of music. He proved that when you stare long enough into the abyss doesn't just stare back. It hands you a knife and tells you to use it. If this chilling journey into the frozen heart of darkness kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button, share this video with your metalhead friends, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 9, where we will uncover the story of a Swedish metal icon who committed a hate crime as part of a satanic ritual.
Number 9. Jon Nödtveidt. We remain in the freezing, shadowy realm of Scandinavian metal, moving from the forests of Norway to the streets of Gothenburg, Sweden, to uncover a crime that was not driven by a rivalry or a thrill, but by a twisted, philosophical devotion to pure evil. This is the story of Jon Nödtveidt, the frontman of the legendary melodic black metal band Dissection. To his fans, he was a musical visionary, a guitarist who blended aggression with haunting beauty, creating albums like The Somber Lane and Storm of the Light's Bane that are still considered masterpieces of the genre. But Jon Nödtveidt was not just a musician playing a role. He was a true believer in the most terrifying sense of the word. He was a leader of the misanthropic Luciferian order, MLO, a radical, chaos Gnostic satanic cult that preached that the world was a prison, life was a mistake, and violence was a key to spiritual liberation. For Jon, the darkness wasn't an aesthetic, it was a religion, and that religion demanded blood. This is the story of a hate crime wrapped in the guise of a ritual, a murder that exposed the lethal consequences of unchecked extremism. We are nearing the end of our investigation into the 10 most shocking cases where rock stars became killers. If you have the stomach for the darkest true crime stories in existence, subscribe to our channel right now. And if you want to support this deep dive into the abyss of the metal underground, hit the like button to help the algorithm find other truth seekers. The horror unfolded in the summer of 1997. Jon Nödtveidt was at the height of his musical powers, but his mind was consumed by the teachings of the MLO. He had befriended a man named Vlad, an Iranian national who shared his extremist views. Together, they spiraled into a world of magic, nihilism, and hatred. They spent their days discussing the annihilation of the cosmos and their nights looking for trouble. On the evening of July 22, 1997, the rhetoric turned into action. Jon and Vlad had been drinking heavily, fueling their aggression. They wandered into Kaler's Park, an old stone-walled park in the heart of Gothenburg. It was a place known as a meeting spot for gay men, a fact that Jon and Vlad, fueled by a toxic mix of homophobia and satanic misanthropy, were well aware of. They were hunting. They weren't looking for a specific enemy, they were looking for a victim, a vessel to pour their hatred into. In the shadows of the park, they encountered Joseph Ben Medour. He was a 37-year-old Algerian national, a quiet man who had nothing to do with the metal scene, nothing to do with Satanism, and nothing to do with the war Jon was fighting in his head. He was simply a man in a park. When Jon and Vlad approached him, the interaction was initially confusing. They asked him questions, perhaps testing him, perhaps toying with him. Joseph, sensing the danger radiating from the two men, dressed in black leather, tried to leave. He tried to walk away, but Jon and Vlad were not going to let their prey escape. They followed him. The psychological terror turned physical. They stopped him. Vlad produced a pistol, but it wasn't a robbery. They didn't want his wallet. They wanted his life. In a cold, senseless act of execution, Joseph was shot, once in the back as he tried to flee, and then, as he lay on the ground, he was shot again in the head. It was a brutal, cowardly termination of an innocent life, committed by men who believed they were superhuman warriors of chaos. The murder of Joseph Ben Medour shocked Sweden. It wasn't just a killing, it was a hate crime, a satanic crime, a xenophobic crime. It tapped into every fear the public had about the metal underground. Jon and Vlad fled the scene, but like many arrogant criminals before them, they were not as smart as they thought they were. They had been seen. They had left traces. The police investigation closed in rapidly. When Jon was arrested, his reaction was chilling. He didn't break down. He didn't cry. He treated the interrogation like a philosophical debate. He viewed his imprisonment not as a punishment, but as a test of his will, a part of his path. He was charged with being an accessory to murder. Though reports vary on who pulled the trigger, both were held responsible for the act. The court saw through the pseudo-intellectual satanic babble and saw two thugs who had murdered a defenseless man in a park. Jon Nödtveidt was found guilty of being an accessory to murder and possession of an illegal firearm. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 7 years, released in 2004. But the story doesn't end with his release. Most people, after serving time for a hate crime murder, would disappear, hide in shame, or try to rebuild a quiet life. Jon Nödtveidt did the opposite. He immediately reformed dissection. He released a new album, Rien Kaus, which was essentially a musical manifesto of the MLO's beliefs. He toured the world. He gave interviews where he stood by his actions, never expressing true remorse for the life he took, viewing it all as part of his becoming. It was a disturbing spectacle, a convicted killer being cheered on stages across Europe. But Jan's path had a final, predetermined destination. On August 13, 2006, inside his apartment in Stockholm, Jan completed his ritual. He lit candles. He placed a satanic grimoire in front of him, and he shot himself in the head inside a circle of candles. He was 31 years old. He had stated in interviews that he would end his life when he felt he had achieved his purpose. His suicide was the final act of his extremist ideology. This case leaves us with a terrifying question about the power of belief. Do you think Jon Nödtveidt was a true believer who followed his twisted philosophy to the bitter end? Or was he just a hateful, homophobic murderer who used Satanism to justify a cowardly crime? Does the philosophy matter when there is an innocent dead body in the park? I want to hear your verdict on this dark chapter of music history in the comments below. Jon Nödtveidt is remembered by fans for his riffs, but history remembers him for the park in Gothenburg. He proved that when you worship death, death eventually comes for you, but not before you inflict it on the innocent. If this journey into the mind of a musical extremist left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video with your metalhead friends, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 10, the final and most historically significant chapter, where we will travel back to the early 20th century to uncover the story of a blues legend who sang his way out of a murder conviction.
Number 10. Leadbelly. We end our journey into the heart of musical darkness by traveling back to the very beginning, to the dust and the heat of the early 20th century, to meet the man who wrote the blueprint for the bad boy image long before rock and roll even had a name. Before Sid Vicious snarled, before Varg Vikernes burned churches, and before Phil Spector pulled a gun, there was Huddy Ledbetter, known to history and to legend as Leadbelly. To the modern ear, he is the voice behind Goodnight Irene and the Midnight Special, or the man whose song Where Did You Sleep Last Night was immortalized by Kurt Cobain during Nirvana's MTV Unplugged performance. He's a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, a folk hero, and a national treasure. But the king of the 12-string guitar was also a man with a temper as explosive as a stick of dynamite, a brawler who carried a pistol and a knife, and a convicted murderer who didn't just sing about the chain gang, he lived on it. This is the story of the original gangster of music, a man who literally sang his way out of a prison cell, proving that talent can sometimes be the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. We have investigated 10 of the most shocking cases where music legends turned into killers. If you have followed us through this dark history, if you believe that understanding the roots of the music requires understanding the violence that often fueled it, please subscribe to this channel right now. And if you appreciate the depth of this series, hit the like button to support the channel as we conclude this investigation. The story of Leadbelly's crime takes us to DeKalb, Texas, in the winter of 1917. Huddy Ledbetter was already known as a musicianer, a man who wandered the country playing juke joints and parties, but he was also known for his quick temper and his prowess with his fists. He wasn't a man to be crossed. On the night of December 13, 1917, he got into a dispute with a man named Will Stafford. Stafford wasn't a stranger. He was a relative by marriage, a friend, a part of Huddy's circle. The argument, as is so often the case in these tragedies, was over a woman. The tension between the two men had been simmering for weeks, but on this night it boiled over into lethal violence. As they walked down a dark road, an argument erupted. Stafford, perhaps thinking it was just another fistfight, underestimated the rage of the future legend. Leadbelly didn't throw a punch. He pulled out a .38 caliber pistol. He didn't fire a warning shot. He turned and shot Will Stafford directly in the head, killing him instantly. It was a cold, decisive act of execution, a moment where the music stopped and the reality of life in the Jim Crow South crashed down. Leadbelly fled, but he was quickly captured by the local sheriff. The trial was swift. In 1918, Huddy Ledbetter was convicted of murder and assault to kill. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison at the Imperial Farm in Sugar Land, Texas. This was not a modern prison. This was a labor camp, a hell on earth where inmates were worked to death in the cane fields under the brutal Texas sun. It was a place designed to break men, but it didn't break Leadbelly. It made him a legend. He became the king of the garden, the hardest worker on the chain gang, and he used his music as a survival tool. This is where the legend of singing for his freedom was born. In 1925, Texas Governor Pat Neff visited the prison. Leadbelly managed to get close enough to perform a song he had written specifically for the governor, a ballad pleading for a pardon, promising that if he were released, he would never commit a crime again. The governor, captivated by the man's immense talent and charisma, reportedly granted the pardon. Huddy walked free, having served only 7 years of a 30-year murder sentence. It is one of the most famous stories in folk history, the power of a song literally unlocking a prison door. But the violence inside him wasn't gone. It was just dormant. Leadbelly was a free man, but he was still Huddy Ledbetter. In 1930, he found himself in Louisiana, and once again, his temper got the better of him. He was at a party when a fight broke out with a group of white men who were reportedly harassing him. Leadbelly pulled a knife and stabbed a man named Dick Ellett multiple times. He was arrested again. This time, he was charged with attempted murder. He was convicted and sent to the playful-sounding but notoriously brutal Angola prison in Louisiana. It seemed his career was over, that he would die in a prison uniform. But lightning struck twice. In 1933, the folklorists John and Alan Lomax visited Angola to record Negro folk songs for the Library of Congress. They found Leadbelly. They were stunned by his voice, his library of songs, and his virtuosity on the 12-string guitar. They recorded him in prison. Once again, a petition for a pardon was sent to the governor of Louisiana, accompanied by a recording of Leadbelly singing "Good Night, Irene." And once again, the magic worked. Leadbelly was released in 1934. He became a star, touring the world, playing Carnegie Hall and influencing generations of musicians. But the shadow of Will Stafford, the man he shot in the head in 1917 and the man he stabbed in 1930, always loomed over him. This story forces us to ask a difficult question about the separation of art and violence. Leadbelly gave the world incredible music, but he was a convicted murderer and a violent repeat offender. Do we forgive the artist because of the art? Would we be so forgiving if he weren't a musical genius? I want to read your final thoughts on this complex legacy in the comments below. Leadbelly died in 1949, not in a prison cell, but in a hospital in New York City, a free man and a legend. But his story is the foundation of the rock and roll outlaw archetype. He proved that talent could be a shield against the consequences of even the most violent crimes. He was the first to show that if you sing loud enough and play well enough, the world might just let you get away with murder. This concludes our deep dive into the 10 rock stars who committed cold-blooded murder. We have traveled from the cane fields of Texas to the frozen forests of Norway, seeing that the hands that create beauty can also destroy life. If this series opened your eyes to the hidden history of music, please hit the like button, share this video with every music fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed and have the bell turned on. We have a new investigation starting next week that you will not want to miss.